The Bhagavad Gita, a social studies textbook, tells us that it is the holy book of the Hindus. Should one read Bhagavad Gita as a religious book then? That would be little odd because the Gita predates organized religion itself. It was written 500 years ago before Jesus Christ, 1,000 years ago before the Muhammad the Prophet, 2,000 years before Hinduism itself was a thing. Reading it as a book of religion also does not quite explain its consistent, sustained appeal over thousands of years, not just among the people of its own community, but with people across the world. So, reading it as a religious book is a sort of limiting way to read the Gita. What then is the magic of this slim volume of poetry? What is it about this age old conversation between two best friends, Krishna and Arjuna, that make people return to it generation after generation, return to its shining moral compass for guidance whenever they are beset by despair or doubt? Well, here's the secret. The Gita's strength lies in the fact that it concerns itself not just with the metaphysical, but with the very physical. Not just with the otherworldly, but with the very worldly. Not just with the afterlife, but with life itself. And it is for the same reason that in 1925, Mahatma Gandhi said the following words: I find solace in the Bhagavad Gita that I miss even in the Sermon on the Mount. When disappointment stares me in the face and all alone I see not one ray of light, I go back to the Bhagavad Gita. I find a verse here and a verse there, and I immediately begin to smile in the midst of overwhelming tragedies. And my life has been full of external tragedies, and if they have left no visible, no indelible scar on me, I owe it all to the teachings of the Bhagavad Gita. The Bhagavad Gita, or Bhagavat, the Lord, and Gita, song, the song of the Lord in this case being Sri Krishna, who in Hindu mythology is regarded as an incarnation, an embodiment. In Sanskrit language, an avatar of Vishnu, the Supreme Lord, the personification of the ultimate reality underlying this universe. The Bhagavad Gita was probably compiled about 5th century BC, and it forms the great epic, and it forms a part of the great epic called the Mahabharata. It's attributed to the sage by the name of Vyasa and contains a complete epitome of the whole central doctrine of Hinduism known as the Vedanta. It's very fascinating and to us a puzzling fact that Gandhi, preeminently the man of non-violence in the modern times, and so many other great people in the world were so devoted to this book. And this is because the scene with which the book opens is a battlefield. The battlefield of Kurukshetra, the Mahabharata, where the opposing armies face each other and the battle is about to begin. And Arjun is thinking hard, confused, oppressed, with the senselessness of the struggle and intentness in war. And then the Gita says in the first chapter, he was overcome with great compassion and uttered this in sadness. When I see my own people arrayed and eager to fight, O Krishna, my limbs quail, my mouth goes dry, my body shakes, and my hair stands on end. And I see evil omens, O Krishna, nor do I see any good by slaying my own people in the fight. I do not long my victory, O Krishna, nor kingdom, nor pleasures. Of what use this kingdom to us, O Krishna, or enjoyment, or even life? And having spoken thus on the battlefield, Arjuna sat on the seat of chariot, casting away his bow and arrows, his spirit overwhelmed by sorrow. And that's exactly how the Gita begins. It begins with confusion. It begins with dilemma. It begins with lack of meaning. Every young man or lady is going to have confusion. Every young man is going to have dilemmas, to do or not to do, to be or not to be. And then Krishna becomes his mentor, gives Arjuna guidance in a way such that he can now start doing what he's meant to do. Krishna kind of guides Arjun through and empowers Arjun to make his own choice. Krishna does not fight the battle of Arjun. Krishna only acts as a facilitator and empowers Arjun to understand that he is way more powerful than the people he is going to face in the battle. Every young man and lady needs to understand that we are way more powerful than they are going through at the moment. Their confusions are smaller than them. Their challenges are smaller than them. Their problems are smaller than them. Their heartbreaks, as painful as they are, but they are still smaller than them, and they have the capacity to overcome them. And thus, on listening to the complaint of a charioteer, the Lord Krishna replies in the first chapter, "Whence has come to thee the dejection of spirit in this hour of crisis? It is unknown to men of noble mind. Yield not to this unmanliness, O Arjuna, for it does not become thee. Cast off this petty faint-heartedness and arise, O oppressor of the foes." And to give point to his words, Krishna goes on, "Thou grievest for those whom thou should not grieve, and yet thou speakest words about wisdom. Wise men do not grieve for the dead, not for the living. Never was there a time when I was not, nor thou, nor these lots of men. Nor will there ever be time hereafter when I shall cease to be. And as the soul passes through this body, through childhood, youth, and age, even so is it taking another body. The sage is not perplexed by this. Heat and cold, pleasure and pain come and go, and do not last forever. The man who is not troubled by these, O chief of men, who remains the same in pain and pleasure, who is wise, makes himself fit for eternal life. Of the non-existent, there is no coming to be. Of the existent, there is no seeking to be. Therefore fight, O Arjuna, he who thinks that this slays, and he who thinks that this is slain, both of them fail to perceive the truth. This one is neither slays nor is slain. He is never born, nor does he die at any time. Nor having come to thee does he again cease to be. He is unborn, eternal, permanent, and primeval. He is not slain when the body is slain. The fundamental doctrine of the Hindus is that the innermost reality of men is not quite what we often misunderstand as soul. We have often been told for every mortal, an individual soul is the principle of every human being. But in the Hindu doctrine, the soul is not individual. The soul is supra-individual, or as they would say in the technical language, the Atman. The soul or self. I think self is really a better translation than soul. The Atma is identical with Brahm. A Brahm is the name which in Hindu philosophy used for ultimate reality which underlies this whole universe. Now I don't want you to think of Brahm as some vast blob of perfectly transparent jello which penetrates the whole world. I think this is what many people imagine when they hear this kind of thing. The whole point of Brahm idea is missed. When you form any image of it in your mind at all, even jello, even empty space or boundless light, Brahm is what we ourselves really are. What the whole universe is fundamentally and actually. There is no way of thinking about, of imagining that, for a very simple reason that as water cannot rise higher than its own level, thought cannot think what is higher than thinking. The essential teaching which the Gita is trying to convey is that the real center and soul, the basic reality of you and I, is not the superficial consciousness which we ordinarily call myself. What we are fundamentally is this unthinkable source of life and existence named Brahm, the expansive. And so Krishna goes on. He who knows that it is indestructible and eternal, uncreated and unchanging, how can such a person slay anyone, O Arjuna, or cause anyone to slay? Just as a person casts off worn out garments and puts on others that are new, even so does the embodied soul cast off worn out bodies and take on others that are new. Weapons do not cleave this self, fire does not burn him, water does not make him wet, nor does the wind make him dry. He is uncleavable, he cannot be burned. He can neither be wetted nor dried. He is eternal, all pervading, unchanging, and immovable. He is the same forever. He is said to be manifest, unmanifest, unthinkable, and unchanging. Therefore, knowing him as such, thou shalt not grieve. Even if you think that the self is perpetually born and perpetually died, even then, O mighty arm, thou should not grieve. For the one that is born, death is certain, and certain is birth for the one that has died. Therefore, for what is unavoidable, thou should not grieve. Perhaps the last passage needs a little bit of interpretation. For the one that is born, death is certain is a statement, of course, which is obvious enough. But not so obvious to us is certain is death for the one that has died. I should try to explain this a little bit because it's a passage expressive of what is called in the Hindu philosophy the doctrine of rebirth or reincarnation. I think it is true to say that according to the strict doctrine of the Vedanta, there is not an individual soul which passes from life to life. For one who transmigrates is this Atma or Brahm, and this is why we have to imagine the state of before birth and after birth as blank annihilation. Because thought it's annihilated in trying to grasp with the reality which lies deeper than thinking. The finger that struggles to touch its own tip finds only the empty air. And so Krishna goes on. The dweller in the body of everyone, O Arjuna, is eternal and can never be slain. Therefore thou should not grieve for any creature. Further, having regard for thy own duty, thou should not falter. There exists no greater good for a Kshatriya than a war enjoyed by duty. Let me explain this passage that I have just read. A Kshatriya is a member of 4 great castes of Hindu society. Those castes being respectively Brahmin, which is a priestly caste, Kshatriya, the caste of warriors and rulers, Vaishya, the caste of merchants, and Shudra, the farmers. And each caste has its own duty in life, which in Sanskrit is Swadharma. And this is the phrase which Krishna uses here when he says, having regard for thine own duty, for thy own Swadharma. Swa, self, dharma, function. Swadharma is probably best translated in English as vocation. A Kshatriya is one who has a vocation to fight. That's its job. Just like a soldier in the army, it's his job to kill the enemy. He cannot say, taking a moral high ground, that okay, it's evil to kill. No, that's his job. Similarly, Arjuna's objection to taking part on war is a sentimental one. He is unwilling to fight in the battle because of his depressed emotions in regard to slaying his kinsmen, or we should say in regards to slaying own fellow men. If one would be pacifist because one is merely squeamish, then surely there is something phony about such pacifism because it is sentimental. This does seem to be Arjuna's objection. And this is why Krishna says, in effect, your objection to slaying is a fear of slaying, a squeamishness to slay, and because of this, you do not have a genuine objection to slay. If you refrain from taking part in battle because you are frightened of doing so, or because you are sentimental, you are not the kind of person who really has a right to abstain from battle. Now, why does he say this? The reason is that in the Hindu philosophy, one who abstains to do something out of fear that that act might be evil has not really liberated himself from evil. And then Krishna would say that so long as our conduct is motivated by fear on one hand or by desire on the other, we are incapable of performing a truly moral action. Only those actions are truly moral which are unmotivated, because if you are motivated to do good by fear, your good may under circumstances be evil. This is the case with Arjuna. He wants to refrain from war for the same reason for which many others would engage in war. Many people engage in war because they are afraid and not at all because they hate. The world situation in the present time might be said to be a situation of mutual fear, where the only reason why someone might start a war would be for fear of the other side starting it first. After all, we all know now that modern warfare is something in which neither side wins. It is then fear more than anything else, fear that the other fellow should send the bombs over first is what starts a war. And this, you see, fear is no deterrent to war at all. A person whose reluctance to fight is based on fear or squeamishness does then, in Krishna's view, have the right to renounce it. He must not be non-violent on sentimental grounds, but rather because he sees it as his swadharma. This is to say, his vocation in life. And so, a moments later, Krishna formulates the principle of action. He says, therefore arise, O son of Kunti, Arjuna, resolve on battle, treating alike pleasure and pain, gain and loss, victory and defeat. To action alone hast thou right, never atoll to its free fruits. Let not the fruits of action be thy motive, neither let there be any attachment to inaction. Fixed in yoga, that is to say, in union with the principle, with the self, do thy work of winner of wealth, abandoning attachment with an even mind in success and failure, for evenness of mind is called yoga. One who has yoked his intelligence with the divine, cast away even here both good and evil. Therefore strive for yoga. Yoga is skill in action. The principle, you see, which he enunciates is to act without attachment to the fruits of action. To do what you have to do without seeking either evil or good from it. Now, this is simply another way of saying to act without motive. The point, you see, of the Hindu philosophy is that in reality, each one of us is that unmotivated one. The root and ground of our Solomon mind is the same as the root and ground of the whole universe. Therefore, one in whom this is fully realized can act in an unmotivated way. In studying the philosophy of Hindus and while reading Gita, we have to get used to this idea that it is really an illusion to suppose that every event is motivated, determined, or caused by the past. What they call karma or causation by the past is in fact maya or unreality. For in the Hindu philosophy, the crescent of the universe or the eternal now of the universe is not the consequence of its past, but rather the past is always the consequence of the present of the eternal now. And thus, it is through the realization that one is the eternal now, not his past, that Arjuna is able to act in a free way, in an unmotivated way, and thus goes into the battle. Not because he is moved to fight by hate, by squeamishness or fear, but because he carries out his appointed place in a society in which it's his vocation, it's his swadharma to be a warrior. We may think of it regrettably that the society exists in which there is a vocation to be a warrior, but let's not be sentimental in this respect also, because every one of us is unable to live at all without killing something. Some of us would like to rule out altogether the killing of a fellow man. But you see, in the Hindu view of life, there isn't this rigid distinction between man on one hand and animal and plants on the other hand, which exists elsewhere. Therefore, there are times in the Hindu view when killing is an unavoidable condition of being alive. And this is one of the problems that Gita sets itself to solve. Apart from this, there are numerous takeaways one can have from this book. For example, one of the lessons that stayed with me is a particular text from the second chapter of Gita, which talks about summer and winter season. And this particular text says, the summer and the winter season keeps on coming and going every year. Seasons change. And just because seasons change, we never stop performing our duties. This text of Gita in chapter 2 tells us that we have to learn to tolerate the ups and the downs and not be distracted from what our main purpose is. So that's something that stayed with me a lot. Tolerate what you are going through. Like when we talk about tolerating pain and loss, we can understand. But we also have to learn to tolerate our success and the good times, because both distract us. Usually we only look at the negatives as distraction, but even the positives distract us from what we are meant to be doing. That's something that really kind of stayed with me. The other thing that really resonated with me in the Gita is a verse from the 6th chapter, which talks about mind being a friend or an enemy to me. It depends on how you deal with the mind. If you befriend your mind, the mind will become your friend and will empower you to do what you want to do. But if you don't deal with it rightly, the mind will become your enemy and will lead you to your downfall. There are numerous chapters, I think, and every chapter has something to convey. People often talk about 11th chapter a lot, wherein the Krishna gives Arjuna the Drishti and shows Arjuna his full splendor of his might. And people call this as one of the most important chapter to read. But the chapter that stuck with me is the 4th chapter. See, life is all about breathing, rhythmic breathing. You can't just breathe in and keep the breath there, can you? No. You can't just breathe out and keep the breath there, can you? No. The 4th chapter of the Bhagavad Gita calls this smooth rhythm of breathing as Yajna, where you take to give. You take, you give. It's taking in and giving out. Taking in, giving out. Yes, we must take. If you don't take, how will you give? If you don't feel hope, how will you bring hope to someone? If you don't feel loved, how will you give love to someone? If you don't feel uplifted, how will you uplift someone? If you don't have the resources, how will you share resources with others? So have, take, be successful, earn a lot, get there, and serve. Give your time, give your resources, give your mind, give hope, give love, give something. And the most important thing that Gita throughout the book strives to do is to change our perspective of the world that is around us. How do we start looking at the presence of divinity everywhere, in every aspect? You don't necessarily have to go to a place of worship to look at the presence of divinity. You can look at the presence of divinity in nature. You can look at the presence of divinity in other people. You can start by looking at the splendor of the Creator in creation. See, it's easy to look at the divinity when you visit a mountain, a roaring ocean. It's easy to see divinity. You feel small, your ego is diminished, and you bow down to that divinity. But in order to see divinity in someone else, you have to have a certain perspective, and that is not easy. When you look at someone who is better than you, and especially if they are in the same field, usually there is insecurity or there is envy, jealousy. Sometimes it goes to the extent of sabotaging that other person's work. So, when you start looking at divinity in creation, we start looking at how divinity has empowered somebody to do something in a special way. That person has been gifted by a higher power, and to sabotage that person's work, or to be envious about that person, or to feel insecure means actually insulting somebody who has been given that gift to him. But if I look at the person and derive inspiration from that person, I can seek that inspiration to follow my aspirations. I read these selections from the translation of the Bhagavad Gita, translated by Swami Prabhupada, who is the Acharya and founder of the International Society for Krishna Consciousness, ISKCON. The translation is published by, I think, Bhakti Vedanta Book Trust. I don't know the price of this book, for it was gifted to me by a very dear friend. It's one of the best of many translations that I know, and it's provided throughout with an excellent commentary. I think we all must read it. Thank you.